David stood outside the rundown convenience store, the Arizona sun beating down relentlessly. Dust devils danced in the distance, mirroring the turmoil in his gut. Just moments ago, he'd handed over his last $18 to a young woman named Sarah. She'd looked so desperate, her eyes wide with a plea for help, explaining she needed gas to get her sick child to a clinic in the next town. He'd seen that look before, in places far more desolate than this forgotten stretch of highway, and he hadn't been able to turn away. Now, his wallet was a hollow testament to his impulsive generosity, completely empty. Not even a crumpled bill for a meager meal. A familiar voice, sharp and cynical, echoed in the quiet confines of his mind. "What have you done, man? You're broke. You just gave away your last dollar to a complete stranger." It was the voice of doubt, of self-preservation, a constant companion since he'd left the military. He pushed it down, deep into the recesses of his memory. He'd seen worse, been in situations far more dire with far less hope. This was just a temporary setback, a slight miscalculation in his already precarious existence. He took a deep, steadying breath, the kind he used to take before breaching a compound, forcing himself to focus, to accept the reality of the situation. It's done. No point regretting it. She looked like she really needed it. He repeated the mantra, a small act of defiance against the nagging voice. His gaze swept over his empty wallet one last time before he tucked it back into his worn jeans. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the desert heat, he turned and began the short walk towards his old, beat-up pickup truck. It was the only thing he still owned, a rusty, faithful relic that had been with him through thick and thin, a symbol of his stubborn refusal to give up, even when everything else had. He climbed into the driver's seat, the worn fabric hot against his skin. The air inside the cab was stifling, thick with the smell of old coffee and lingering dust. His eyes automatically flickered to the dashboard. The gaslight, a tiny, malevolent orange eye, glowed ominously. It had been on for days, a constant, silent harbinger of this exact moment. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his chest, that he couldn't make it to the next town, not even close. He was stuck, truly, irrevocably stuck. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the headrest, feeling the relentless heat of the Arizona sun pressing down on the roof of the truck, through the metal, into his very bones. Sometimes, you just gotta trust your gut, even when it costs you everything. The words formed unbidden in his mind, a strange, almost poetic justification for his current predicament. He didn't know where they came from, or why they felt so right, but he held on to them. As David sat there, defeated but not entirely broken, a low rumble vibrated through the ground. It was faint at first, a distant growl that could have been anything. A passing truck on the highway, a trick of the wind, the desert playing its usual auditory games. But then it grew louder, steadily, purposefully, morphing into a distinct, mechanical thrum that pulled him from his self-pity. He opened his eyes, scanning the horizon through the dusty windshield. What was that sound? It wasn't the familiar drone of a semi, nor the distant roar of a military jet. It was something else, something heavier, more deliberate. The sound intensified, a growing presence in the vast, empty landscape. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The remote, dusty expanse of Arizona, particularly the unforgiving terrain near the Superstition Mountains, had become David's sanctuary and his prison. It was a place where the sun reigned supreme, baking the earth into a hard, cracked canvas, and where human settlements were sparse, often separated by miles of scrub brush and ancient rock formations. Here, people learned to keep to themselves, to value self-reliance above all else. Neighbors were not a quick wave from across the street, but a distant flicker of light on the horizon, hours away by an unpaved road. Help, when needed, was a precious commodity, not easily found or offered. The nearest semblance of civilization, a small town called Apache Junction, sat about an hour's drive away, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of the desert, a mix of old Western grit and the harsh realities of modern-day struggles. Its inhabitants were a tough, resilient lot, wary of outsiders but possessing an unspoken code of honor. If someone truly needed help, and you could give it, you did. That was the unwritten law of the desert, a stark contrast to the bureaucratic complexities David had encountered in the world outside. David's days in this desolate landscape were simple, almost monastic in their solitude. He rose before dawn, often with the first hint of light painting the eastern sky in hues of orange and purple. His mornings were typically spent tinkering with his truck, a constant battle against rust and the wear and tear of the desert roads, or hiking the winding trails that snaked through the Superstition Mountains. These solitary treks were his way of clearing the incessant noise in his head, a temporary reprieve from the memories that clung to him like the desert dust. He'd occasionally find odd jobs in Apache Junction, manual labor mostly, enough to keep him afloat. And when money was particularly tight, he'd hunt small game, a skill honed by necessity and his past life, to supplement his meager income. The social norms here were stark and uncompromising. Don't ask for help. Don't show weakness. Yet, beneath that hardened exterior, there was a quiet understanding, a respect for those who navigated this harsh environment with integrity. David, however, carried a different kind of burden. He was estranged from his family back east, a gaping wound that never quite healed. The war had changed him in ways they couldn't comprehend, creating an unbridgeable chasm between them. The loneliness was a constant companion, a silent weight he bore each day. The true antagonist in David's life wasn't a person, but an insidious combination of his own internal struggles. The invisible scars of PTSD, the gnawing financial hardship that had followed him like a shadow since his service ended. These were the enemies he fought daily. He struggled to reintegrate, to find a purpose outside the structured chaos of combat. The memory of a specific moment in Afghanistan, a split-second decision he'd made under unimaginable pressure, haunted his waking hours and tormented his sleep. This internal antagonist constantly whispered doubts and fears, eroding his self-worth, reminding him of his failures. Small signs of this internal battle manifested themselves in his daily life. He often woke in a cold sweat, the echoes of distant explosions or urgent shouts still ringing in his ears. Crowds made him uneasy, triggering an instinctive need to assess threats, to find an exit. Loud noises, an unexpected backfire, a dropped plate would make him flinch, his body tensing, ready for a fight that wasn't there. He found it difficult to hold down a steady job, not because of a lack of skill or work ethic, but because the mundane routines of civilian life often felt overwhelming, alienating. He felt like he didn't fit in, a square peg in a round hole. He was always on edge, perpetually waiting for something to go wrong, a residual effect of years spent in high-stakes environments. The gaslight in his truck, glowing stubbornly for the past 2 days, was more than just an indicator of low fuel. It was a constant, mocking reminder of his precarious situation, a symbol of how close he was to the edge, always. David had joined the Navy right out of high school, a skinny kid from a small town with a burning desire for purpose, for something bigger than himself. He'd found it, or so he thought, in the grueling, unforgiving world of the Navy SEALs. The training had been brutal, a relentless gauntlet designed to break the weak and forge the strong. He'd excelled, pushing past every physical and mental barrier, finding a strange comfort in the intense focus, the absolute clarity of mission. The camaraderie forged in those fires was unlike anything he'd ever known, a brotherhood built on trust and shared hardship. His first deployment to Afghanistan had been a baptism by fire, but also a confirmation of his ideals. He believed in what he was doing, in the justice and freedom he was fighting for. The desert landscape, ironically, had mirrored the Arizona terrain he now inhabited, but the stakes had been immeasurably higher. Then came the turning point, a mission that went sideways in a flash of chaotic violence. A civilian family, caught in the crossfire of a desperate skirmish, became collateral damage. In a split-second decision, David had chosen to prioritize his team's survival, a call that saved their lives but resulted in unintended tragic consequences for the innocent family. His superiors had commended his actions, assuring him it was the right call under extreme pressure, a necessary evil of war. But the guilt had festered, a corrosive acid eating away at his soul. It was the seed of his internal struggle. The moment his idealism began to shatter. When he returned home, the disconnect was immediate, palpable. His friends and family, steeped in the comfort of their suburban lives, couldn't fathom the horrors he'd witnessed, the decisions he'd been forced to make. They expected the old David, the carefree kid who'd left for boot camp. But that David was gone, replaced by a haunted, distant stranger. He tried to explain, to bridge the chasm, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. They looked at him with pity, or worse, with a kind of fearful reverence that only deepened his isolation. The humiliations of post-service life had piled up like sandbags. The job interviews were the worst. He'd sit across from some clean-cut HR manager, trying to translate his elite military skills into corporate jargon, only to be met with polite smiles and the dismissive verdict, "You're overqualified," or "Your skills don't quite translate." The frustration was a slow burn, the insult a constant sting. He knew he could lead, strategize, execute under pressure, but they saw only a man who didn't fit their neat little boxes. Then there was the labyrinthine VA system, endless paperwork, long wait times, being shuffled from one department to another, each one more impersonal than the last. He felt like a number, another veteran lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, not a hero who had risked his life for his country. The promises of support, of care, of a smooth transition to civilian life never fully materialized, leaving him adrift in a sea of red tape. His relationship with Emily, his girlfriend since high school, had been another casualty. She'd tried, bless her heart, to understand his nightmares, his emotional distance, the way he flinched at sudden movements. But eventually, the strain became too much. She couldn't handle the ghost of the man he had become, and he couldn't offer her the comfort she deserved. She left, not with anger, but with a quiet, heartbroken resignation, leaving him even more isolated, more alone. The financial ruin had followed swiftly, losing his apartment, selling off most of his possessions just to keep a roof over his head, then eventually living out of his truck. The shame of it, the indignity of a decorated veteran, a Navy SEAL, reduced to barely scraping by, was a bitter pill to swallow. The audience, if they could see into his soul, would understand that David's current poverty wasn't just bad luck, wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was the culmination of years of trauma, of systemic failures that often betray those who serve, and of profound personal losses. The act of giving his last $18 to a stranger, an act that seemed so reckless, so illogical on the surface, was in fact a desperate, almost instinctual attempt to find meaning in a world that had stripped him of so much. It was an attempt to help someone else when he felt utterly powerless to help himself. He had been living on the edge, teetering on the brink, for a very long time, and the weight of it all was almost unbearable. David was at his absolute lowest point, a place where the desert seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. For weeks he'd been trying to get a job at the local construction site, a place that always seemed to have a "help wanted" sign out, yet never for him. The foreman, a gruff man named Frank, with a perpetual scowl etched into his sun-weathered face, had consistently put him off. "No work today, Peterson," he'd bark, without even looking up from his clipboard. David knew it was a lie. He'd seen Frank hiring other people, younger guys, fresh out of school, with less experience than David had in his little finger. But they got the nod, while he was dismissed with a wave of the hand. David was desperate, the kind of desperate that gnawed at your gut and stole your sleep. One scorching morning, David approached Frank again, swallowing his pride, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to explain, to convey the urgency of his situation, without sounding like he was begging. "Frank, is there any work at all? Even just cleaning up. I'm ex-military. I need to eat." He had hoped the mention of his service, his past, might elicit a flicker of understanding, a shred of respect. Instead, Frank let out a short, derisive laugh, the sound grating in the morning air. He pointed a greasy finger towards a faded "Help Wanted" sign, tacked to a post further down the road, advertising a dishwashing job at a diner. "Maybe they'll hire a hero to scrub toilets," Frank sneered, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement, then turned his back, effectively ending the conversation. Frank's crew, a motley collection of roughnecks lounging by their trucks, had overheard the exchange. They snickered, their laughter a dull thud against David's already bruised ego. A familiar, dangerous rage began to coil in David's gut, a primal instinct honed in countless combat situations. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment, he was back in Afghanistan, the world narrowing to a single, explosive point. But years of hard-won discipline, of learning to control the beast within, asserted themselves. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the anger down, burying it beneath layers of exhaustion and resignation. He simply stared at Frank's broad, dismissive back for a long moment, the humiliation burning a bitter trail down his throat, then turned and walked away, every step heavy with defeat. He got into his truck, the gaslight still glowing like a malevolent red eye, and started the engine. The old pickup coughed to life, sputtering its protest. He drove slowly, aimlessly at first, then instinctively turned towards the diner Frank had mentioned, a grim acceptance of his fate settling over him. He felt utterly defeated, worthless, a decorated veteran reduced to begging for scraps, then mocked for it. The sun beat down, turning the metal of his truck into an oven, but the heat outside was nothing compared to the cold despair blooming in his chest. As he drove, his gaze drifted to the side of the road. There, walking slowly, her head bowed, her small child clutching her hand, was Sarah, the young woman from yesterday, the one he'd given his last $18 to. She looked even more desperate now, her shoulders slumped, her clothes dusty. Her car was visible a little further up the road, clearly broken down, steam still rising faintly from beneath the hood. David's first instinct, a cynical voice born of his own prolonged suffering, was to drive past. He told himself he couldn't help everyone. He had nothing left to give. He was literally running on fumes, both physically and emotionally. What good would stopping do? But then, the memory of Frank's sneer, of the crew's snickers, of the countless times he himself had been dismissed, ignored, and discarded, flashed through his mind. He saw himself in her desperation, in her visible struggle against overwhelming odds. He saw the raw vulnerability, the silent plea for help that mirrored his own unspoken cries. No, he muttered, surprising himself with the sudden force of his conviction. Not today. Not if I can help it. He pulled the truck over, the engine groaning in protest, the gas light now a frantic blinking warning. He reached into his wallet, a purely habitual gesture, then remembered it was empty. He'd given her his last. His hand paused, hovering over the worn leather. A moment of pure gut-wrenching panic threatened to overwhelm him. What had he done? He was truly stranded now. But then, he remembered the look in her eyes yesterday, the genuine need, the fragile hope. He remembered the quiet dignity with which she had accepted his meager offering. He got out of the truck, the heat instantly oppressive. He walked towards Sarah, his gait purposeful. He looked at her, then at her child, a small, tired face, peering out from behind her legs. He didn't have any money to give this time. He didn't have gas. He didn't have much of anything. But he had his presence. He had his words. He had his belief that no one should be left utterly alone in their despair. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and said, his voice rough but kind, "Don't give up. Someone will help you." He didn't expect anything in return. He just wanted to alleviate her immediate suffering, to offer a glimmer of hope in a world that seemed determined to crush it. This act, seemingly small in its immediate impact, was a profound statement of his character, a defiant refusal to let his own suffering make him indifferent to the suffering of others. He then turned and drove off, the truck sputtering, knowing he was now truly, inescapably stranded. David's truck sputtered and died a few miles down the road, exactly as he had expected. The gaslight, which had been a persistent nagging worry for days, finally won its battle. He was out of gas, stranded in the middle of nowhere, the relentless Arizona sun beating down on him. He tried to call for help, but as fate would have it, his phone battery chose that precise moment to give up its last charge. The screen went black, mirroring the bleakness of his situation. He decided to wait it out. There was nothing else to do. He was used to solitude, to long stretches of silence. The desert, in its vast, indifferent beauty, had become his reluctant companion. He tried to conserve the little water he had left, knowing the desert heat was no joke, especially as the afternoon wore on. He watched the sun begin its slow descent, painting the sky in the hues of orange and purple. As the stars began to appear, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue, David found himself reflecting on his decision to give away his last money. Surprisingly, despite his predicament, he felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. He thought about Sarah and her child, hoping they had made it to the clinic, hoping his small act of kindness had truly helped. Late that night, as the desert air grew cool and the silence deepened, David heard the distant rumble of an engine. It grew steadily louder, a welcome sound in the vast emptiness. A beat-up old pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the darkness, pulled up alongside his stranded vehicle. The driver was an elderly Native American man, his face weathered and wise, his eyes deep and knowing. This was Thomas, a man who lived off the grid nearby, a quiet presence in the vast landscape. Thomas didn't ask many questions, just offered David a ride and, more importantly, a bottle of cool water. He simply nodded when David, feeling a mix of embarrassment and resignation, explained his situation. The empty gas tank, the dead phone, the inconvenient truth of his last 18. As they drove, the old truck rattling along the dusty track, Thomas spoke in a low, calm voice. He told David he had seen him earlier that day at the convenience store. He had also seen Sarah. He mentioned that Sarah's car had been broken down for a few days, and she'd been struggling, making her way on foot, trying to find help. Thomas's words carried a quiet weight of observation, a deep understanding of the often harsh realities of life in this remote corner of the world. "Good people are rare out here, son," Thomas said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "You helped her when no one else would. That means something." The old man dropped David off at his small, isolated cabin, a place that felt both rustic and strangely comforting. He offered David some food, a simple meal of stew and cornbread, and a place to sleep on a worn but clean cot. He didn't mention the 18 directly again, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared recognition of the value of selfless action. Before Thomas left, heading back out into the moonlit desert, he paused at the door. "You did a good thing today, son," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes good deeds echo further than you think." Then he was gone, driving off into the vast, silent night, leaving David alone with his thoughts. David slept fitfully, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He wondered if he would ever get out of this situation, if he would ever find a way to rebuild his life. He thought about Thomas's words, about the idea that kindness could have an unseen ripple effect. He wondered if Sarah and her child were safe, if they had found the help they needed. The future still seemed bleak, uncertain, a vast, empty expanse stretching before him. But for the first time in a very long time, as he lay there in the quiet solitude of Thomas's cabin, David didn't feel entirely alone. A small, unfamiliar flicker of hope, born from an act of pure altruism, began to stir within him, a tiny ember in the darkness. David woke in the dim light of dawn, the unfamiliar surroundings of Thomas's cabin slowly coming into focus. The cot was surprisingly comfortable, but the familiar weight of his situation, the gnawing anxiety about his truck, his lack of money, and his uncertain future, settled over him like a shroud. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, the wooden floor cool beneath his bare feet. A faint aroma of coffee wafted from the small, efficient kitchen area. Thomas was already up, pouring 2 mugs. David accepted one gratefully, the warmth seeping into his hands. He stepped outside, needing the vastness of the desert to clear his head, to put his thoughts in order. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome respite from the previous day's oppressive heat. He scanned the horizon, his gaze drawn to the east, where the sun was just beginning to paint the sky with streaks of orange and pink. And then he heard it, the rumble. It was the same distant sound he had heard yesterday, just before his truck finally gave out. But now it was much louder, much closer. It wasn't the familiar drone of a single vehicle on the highway. This was something different. David's SEAL training, dormant but never truly absent, snapped to attention. His senses sharpened, every nerve ending tingling. He assessed the sound, dissecting its nuances. It was the distinct thrum of multiple heavy engines, moving in unison, approaching rapidly. He squinted against the rising sun, trying to pierce the shimmering heat haze. At first, they were just dark specks on the horizon, but they grew quickly, kicking up enormous plumes of dust that billowed behind them like smoke signals. 5 large black SUVs, all identical, sleek and imposing, turned off the main road, the gravel crunching loudly under their heavy tires. They were heading directly towards Thomas's isolated cabin, moving with an almost military precision. They looked like government vehicles, or perhaps something out of a high-stakes action movie, utterly out of place in this remote, forgotten corner of Arizona. David's heart rate quickened, a primal surge of adrenaline pumping through his veins. His first reaction was pure, unadulterated instinct. 5 vehicles, unknown occupants, heading straight for him. His mind raced, calculating threats, identifying potential cover. He was ready for anything. An arrest, a mistaken identity, a confrontation. He moved without conscious thought, his hand reaching for the old, well-maintained hunting rifle he knew Thomas kept by the door. He checked the chamber, the familiar weight of the weapon a strange comfort in his hands. He positioned himself strategically, partially obscured by the cabin wall, his eyes never leaving the approaching convoy. The SUVs pulled up to the cabin, forming a precise semicircle, their engines idling with a low growl. The dust they had kicked up slowly began to settle, revealing their dark, polished surfaces. Doors opened with synchronized clicks, and out stepped several men in dark, impeccably tailored suits. They were all large, muscular, and moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of professional training. But it was the woman who emerged from the lead vehicle who truly caught David's attention. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her posture commanding, her expression serious. And then David recognized her. It was Sarah. But this was not the desperate, disheveled Sarah he had encountered yesterday, pleading for gas money. This Sarah exuded an aura of confidence and power, her hair neatly styled, her eyes sharp and intelligent. The transformation was startling, almost unbelievable. Sarah approached David, her gaze unwavering, a complex mix of seriousness and profound gratitude on her face. The men in suits fanned out slightly, creating a subtle perimeter, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. "Mr. Peterson, I presume?" she said, her voice clear and calm, utterly devoid of the desperation he remembered. "My name is Sarah Miller, and I owe you more than 18. She then began to explain, and as she spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming a picture far more intricate than David could have ever imagined. She was the CEO of a major tech company, a global leader in its field. She had been discreetly scouting locations for a new, highly secure R&D facility, a project of immense strategic importance. Yesterday, her breakdown had been a meticulously planned stress test, a social experiment designed to gauge how local communities and individuals within them reacted to someone genuinely in need, stripped of all pretense. Her car hadn't truly broken down. It was equipped with hidden cameras and sensors. Her child, far from being sick, had been perfectly fine, playing quietly with a tablet in the back seat out of sight. David, she explained, had been the only one who stopped, the only one who had reached out, who had given his last to a complete stranger, embodying a level of selfless integrity she rarely encountered. Sarah continued, her words painting a vision that seemed impossibly distant from David's current reality. Her company was not just looking for a location. They were looking for people. People with integrity, resilience, problem-solving skills. especially those with a military background for security and logistics. She looked directly at David, her gaze piercing. She offered him a job, a real job, with an exceptional salary and comprehensive benefits, as the head of security for their new state-of-the-art facility. "I need someone I can trust implicitly, Mr. Peterson," she stated, her voice firm. "Someone who puts others first, even when it costs them everything. Someone like you." Then, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. Sarah mentioned that her team had also observed the reactions of others in the local community. She specifically referenced seeing David being callously dismissed by Frank, the foreman at the construction site. A flicker of disdain crossed her features. "We don't need people like that in our organization, Mr. Peterson. Their short-sightedness and lack of empathy are counterproductive to our values. We need people like you." David, still clutching his rifle, slowly lowered it. The shock, the immense, overwhelming relief, and a profound flicker of vindication played across his face. He looked at Sarah, then at the sleek, powerful SUVs, then back at his humble, borrowed cabin. The contrast was stark, almost surreal. In that moment, he understood. His act of kindness, born from his own hardship and unwavering integrity, had not been a foolish sacrifice. It had opened a door he never could have imagined, a door to a future he had long since given up on. David accepted Sarah's offer, the words feeling foreign, and yet profoundly right as they left his lips. The transition from the dusty, isolated cabin to a comfortable, modern house felt like a dream, but the reality of it settled in quickly. Still nestled within the familiar Arizona landscape, his new home was strategically located closer to the burgeoning construction site of the new tech facility. Here, amidst the hum of progress and innovation, David found himself thriving. His SEAL training, once a source of internal conflict and a skill set seemingly irrelevant to civilian life, now found a genuine and critical purpose. He was no longer just an ex-military man struggling to find his footing. He was the head of security for a multi-million-dollar operation, managing a dedicated team. His expertise and leadership valued beyond measure. The weight of being unneeded, of being a burden, began to lift. The company, true to Sarah's ethical vision, offered comprehensive support systems, including therapy for its employees. David, for the first time, allowed himself to fully engage with the process of healing. He began to address his PTSD, the deep-seated trauma of his past, the haunting memories of Afghanistan that had shadowed his every waking moment. Through candid conversations and guided introspection, he started to process the guilt, the fear, and the profound sense of loss. The ghost of that fateful decision in Afghanistan, which had long whispered doubts and fears into his ear, began to recede, replaced by a quiet strength, a renewed sense of self-worth, born not from combat, but from purpose, and the courage to confront his inner demons. With a newfound sense of peace, David found the courage to reach out to Emily, his ex-girlfriend. The conversation was hesitant at first, filled with unspoken regrets and lingering pain. He explained what had happened to him, not just the miraculous turn of events with Sarah, but the internal journey he had undertaken, the changes he had made. He spoke of the man he was becoming, a man who was finally learning to live with his past, not be defined by it. They started talking regularly, slowly, carefully rebuilding a friendship from the ashes of their fractured relationship. There was no pressure, just a shared understanding, and the quiet, hopeful possibility that something more, something deeper, and more resilient might yet blossom between them. The ripple effects of Sarah's moral compass extended far beyond David's personal life. Sarah Miller continued her trajectory as a highly successful and deeply ethical CEO. Her company, guided by her values, became a beacon of corporate responsibility, using its immense wealth and influence to make tangible, positive impacts on the communities it touched. She remained a mentor and a trusted friend to David, their bond forged in an act of unexpected kindness and mutual respect. As for Frank, the construction foreman who had so callously dismissed David, his fate served as a stark reminder that actions have consequences. Sarah's company, having observed his dismissive and unethical conduct, ultimately brought in its own contractors and workers, valuing integrity and professional conduct above all else. Frank eventually lost his job, a direct consequence of his actions, his dismissive attitudes finally catching up to him. The desert, in its own way, had a peculiar way of balancing the scales. David never forgot Thomas, the quiet, wise man who had offered him water and shelter when he had nothing. He made it a point to stay in touch, regularly visiting Thomas at his isolated home, ensuring the old man had what he needed, offering companionship and gratitude. It was a bond built on shared moments of vulnerability and unexpected kindness, a testament to the profound connection that can form between strangers in the wilderness. Looking out at the vast, sun-drenched Arizona desert from the window of his new home, David often reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. He realized that one simple act of kindness, performed when he had literally nothing left to give, had been the catalyst for everything. It wasn't just about the job or the financial security, or even the renewed hope for his personal life. It was about the profound truth that true wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in integrity, compassion, and the unwavering willingness to help others, even when it costs you dearly. In his darkest hour, by giving his last, David had inadvertently taken the very first step towards gaining everything he had ever truly needed. His story became a powerful message of hope, a living testament that even in the bleakest of times, an act of selfless kindness can indeed be the path to one's own salvation. Sometimes, giving your last is indeed the first step to gaining everything.